sending us, but also what are the challenges and what are the things that God is leading you into. So it's part of the way we're working up, and it's partly moving into us all being called as ambassadors. And then you can pray for the person, or you can simply pray for the person in the intercessions as that kind of moves on. Keep it very short, 2 to 3 minutes. And that, I think, is one of the things that if we were to do that in deaneries, and you might not necessarily do this time tomorrow, because someone will be saying, I'll be sitting at home or in the pub rather than being at this meeting this time tomorrow. But just give you a flavour of what other things are going on in people's lives. And it may be things with citizens as well as things in the workplace. But it begins to change our kind of culture, because culture is formed by conversation. Slightly similar, the other thing we encourage people to do is what we've called Sunday praying for Monday to Saturday living. I think one of the best gifts the Church of England has is our intercessions. The habit of intercessions and the pattern of intercessions is a wonderful gift. But sometimes we either pray for the big stuff out there, or we pray from the Queen down to whichever level we can get to, depending on or the activities in church, and also we pray for people unwell. We do a lot, but actually, do we pray for each other enough in our intercessions? And one of the ways to do this, we call it the ABC of intercessions, is to ask people to write down words that describe their role. So for A, you could have auntie, abattoir assistant, associate director of mission, whatever you might have. But we've all got multiple roles in our lives. We've got multiple places where we're serving God. And to identify these and then put them into the intercessions, you're not necessarily naming people, but you'd be praying for those roles. And someone will be, oh, that's me, I put that one in the box. And there's a little blue postcard on your desks that is available to hand out and have around churches that people can write their roles on. If you've got an intercessions box, they can put it in there. You maybe want to be more explicit. In common worship, there are lists of types of professions and people to pray for. So again, you could just adopt that and use that as the kind of form. But it's that whole thing of we gather together to be sent out to be the people of God. So Sunday praying for Monday to Saturday living. The third practice we talk about is what's noticed on notice boards. So if we think about trying to enact setting God's people free, some churches haven't had their notice boards updated since 1947, let alone 1985. But what's noticed on your church notice board? So if we have this idea of the church sent out by God into God's world, where are those people during the week? And how would you ever know? So just a map with some pictures and photos up. Working with a church in the Dales, it's one of our pilot parishes, and they go all over the place. It's a big rural benefice. But they literally have got pictures of farmers with sheep, and they've got pictures of people who commute into Leeds, and they've got a whole range of where people are, and they vary that. It's a job, I know, it's a task for people to do, but it's another thing of what's noticed on notice boards. We might have our mission organisations that we support. We might have the upcoming PCC. You probably will have the very well-thumbed minutes from the last Deanery Synod. But what's noticed on notice boards is another important signal that we can send. So that's the fifth practice. We're nearly there, and I'll get you talking about how you might want to do it. So these are the Trenemans. The Trenemans are a retired couple, and they spend a lot of time on the buses, picking up people, picking up their granddaughter from school, going shopping. And what they decided that they would do is they wouldn't travel to different places, but they would try to think about how might they use their journey time differently. How might that journey be a journey where God was more present? And so what they started to engage in was talking to people on the buses. Now, depending on where you are in the country, this might be something which is a social, faux pas and no-no. As I said, I'm from Yorkshire. My parents still live in a village just north of Sheffield, in between Sheffield and Barnsley. And when my mum comes to stay with us in London, she's always talking to people on the buses and the trains, and I'm always trying to go into the next carriage. Thinking, you just don't do that. You don't do that, Mum. You know, if you're kind of white British, you don't do that. But actually, what they started doing was they started noticing that some people get on the same bus as them quite regularly. So a nod and a hello is an appropriate place to start, a bit of a conversation. But what they also were trying to do was just be conscious of those little nudgings of what God might be prompting them to do and think and say. And when we hear things by God nudging us, it's not always a loud, audible voice. It's never normally a loud, audible voice. It's normally a sense. It's normally a feeling. And often, this is the flattened transcendence thing. Often what we do is we just put that down to bad cheese the night before, or too much caffeine, or that's a bit weird. Why would I ask? How's business going to a colleague on a platform? I did that once, and the guy broke down into tears because he was in financial difficulty. But that opened up a whole conversation with him that was actually genuinely could have been life-saving. It was one of those things where, it wasn't just an idle thing. I just thought, and we pick up things from people. God works through us to minister to others. So I might have noticed something in his demeanour that made me think something's not quite right here. Well, how do we think God speaks to us? So again, this is part of just these gentle nudgings to say, have you thought about that? And the Trennemans have done this, and their story is one about having a conversation with a young woman who was having a particularly difficult time, and their kind of friendly smiles began a conversation that ended up in a conversation over lunch in a cafe, which ended with this young woman joining their church and their fellowship through that series of conversations. So how we use our time, how we see our time, and how we prompt those nudgings is quite important. And it's about building up a sense of courage as well as confidence for people. So how do we encourage those promptings in everyday life? One of the ways is actually to talked about baptism earlier, but we have very few occasions where we can celebrate where God might be calling and sending people, but we do have them. So we have confirmation, but actually we have things happening all the time in people's lives. So if someone starts a new job, praying for that person as they start a new job. If someone's moving house, praying that house move would go well. Commissioning people, not just for roles in the church, but commissioning people. And it may be that you kind of do this en bloc. At harvest time, if you live in an area where you do have a lot of people in jobs, in both the rural economy, but if you actually asked people in their professions, I had a guy we did this in a harvest service to commission people who had anything to do with food, and he was a supply chain manager. For most people, that's Godspeed the plough stuff, because we get our food through the supermarkets that he works with. So actually they're a vital role. And so we prayed for all people involved in harvest. And we could do that through points of the year, commissioning people. And then the last set of practices is preaching. Preaching matters, and so slightly changing the way that we do our preaching to include more examples of everyday life is part of the way of doing this. And things like the visiting people's workplaces and community places helps those, I'm a reader, but those engaged in preaching to have that vantage point and perspective. But also, this isn't in the booklet, but also recently I've been thinking about the whole notion of testimony. And actually what we're trying to do in preaching is set up a conversation. And testimony is part of that conversation. So you could include, we had testimonies today about the work that Citizens has been doing, and they were really powerful because they're talking about how transformation is happening. So you can include those in preachers if you're involved in preaching, or you could just be asking people to give feedback about how has God been working in your life. But that kind of conversation of testimony, the work of what God is doing amongst us, needs to be heard. And back to the point about kind of how do we encourage people to be more confident in their faith, actually talking about what God is doing and being, rather than just being recipients, is part of the culture change that we need to be involved in. So those are 7 habits, 7 practices, and some churches are adopting all of them. Some cycle